Well, hey everyone, welcome to Epic Life Church for our online services. We're glad you're joining. If you've been with us in previous weeks, welcome back. If this is your first week with us, thank you for spending time with us. We feel honored that you would take some time out of your morning to hang with us. We hope that you're enjoying the service so far. We are in a series called You Make Me Crazy. It's a 4-week series. But before we dive into part 4, which we're going to talk about today, I just want to pause for a moment and share with you my excitement about a new series that we're kicking off starting next Sunday on June 7th. It's a series called Focus. And basically the idea of this series is that we move in the direction of the things that we focus on. And so we want to talk for a number of weeks about how we can focus on the right things. And the cool thing about this is our elementary kids are also going to be going through the exact same stuff at the same time that we are. And so it's going to be kind of a fun thing that families can be doing the same thing together. But I'm excited about that series, and I hope that you tune in next week as we kick that off. I also want to remind you, if you were here with us last week, I want to remind you that we're in this thing called All In. It's a spiritual journey, and we're talking about how we can take our best next step in our spiritual growth journey. And each one of us, that's a different thing for each person. And so I said last week that for the next 6 weeks, I'm going to talk about one specific aspect of your spiritual growth journey that might be the place where you take your best next step in. Now, a few months ago, we designed this really cool tool called the Spiritual Assessment Guide. And on here, we've outlined 6 core habits. They're connecting, serving, Bible reading, prayer, giving, and sharing. And these are these core habits that if we can master these habits in our life, man, it's going to just take us straight to the direction we need to go in our spiritual walk and to go closer to the path that God wants us to be on. Last week, we talked about connecting. Today, I just want to pause and talk about the idea of serving. Serving is a core habit that if we can dial this thing in, if we can really get good at this, it's going to really catapult us forward in our spiritual growth. And the question I have for you is, are you someone who serves? Someone who serves maybe occasionally or rarely? Or are you a servant? And that's really what we want to do, is be a person who considers himself to be a servant, that we're servant-minded in the way we think. And so we've outlined in our spiritual assessment guide tool here several ideas to help you grow in the area of serving. The first area that I want to talk about is serving at home. Now, right now, with social distancing in place, being at home is at an all-time high. We are spending a lot of our waking hours in our home, and what a great opportunity that we have to be able to focus and reflect on this idea of serving and being a servant to the people in our home. So I want to challenge you this week to look for opportunities as you go about your daily routines, as you're interacting with those people that are in your home, and ask yourself, how can I serve them today? And so that's a really great place to start. Another area that you can serve and get better at serving in is at your church. And we have opportunities for you to serve. Not as many opportunities right now, since we're not meeting live to be able to serve on a Sunday morning at a service, but we do have opportunities to serve. In fact, a number of you guys have already served in the last couple of weeks as we've been doing some spring cleaning at our physical location, and we're continuing that. And there's a great way on your connection card to sign up for that. And a new thing that we're trying out called on-demand serving, where you get to sign up on your connection card, and when an opportunity to serve comes up, we can contact you and see if it's a good fit for you. But that's another great place to practice and exercise this idea of serving and getting better at that. And then also in the community. And we actually just completed our 5th blood drive in 6 weeks yesterday. It was packed out. We had 35 people give a total of 29 units of blood, which, by the way, the goal was 24, so blew that number out of the water. It was our 5th blood drive in a row that has been packed out, where they had no open spots in the drive. We have another drive coming up this Tuesday, which happens to also be full. But there are 2 more drives on June 11th and June 30th, and those are 2 opportunities for you to serve in the community, a simple way of just giving blood to serve the people in our community. And then also we got this thing that we do every summer called the Good Neighbor Project. And if you haven't been around for a past summer at Epic Life Church, we do this thing where we take off services at the end of August on a Sunday, and we go out and we serve the community on several different projects. And so we're looking forward to doing that. We're getting ramped up and getting ready to be involved in it this summer, and we'll hear more details along the way. But it's another great opportunity to practice this idea of serving. So I just want you to be thinking about this. By the way, if you would like to get this spiritual assessment guide tool, in your notes on the Notes tab, you can click the link and you can download this, and it's a great guide for you. And it even has a little number system where you can grade yourself on a scale of 1 to 5 and see how you're doing on that. And so I encourage you to do that. You don't have to wait until I talk about some of these other habits. Get in there and check them out yourself. But just want to make sure you had a chance to be thinking about that as we move forward in the next coming weeks. Now today, as I said, we're concluding our You Make Me Crazy series with part 4. Really, we've been diving in to relationships and how we can cultivate healthier relationships. And today, specifically, we're talking about relationship boundaries. Now, before we go any further, I got a question for you. Do you have any crazy makers in your life? People that just drive you crazy. Think about them right now. In fact, maybe they're sitting in the room with you, and if they are, point it out. I'm just joking. Don't do that. You don't want that. That's not going to bode well for you. But the point is that we all have crazy makers in our life. And if you're thinking to yourself right now, I just can't think of anybody right now in my life that's crazy. I got some good news and some bad news for you. The good news is you don't have any crazy makers in your life. The bad news is, guess what? If you can't think of anybody, you're it. You are the crazy maker. So I just thought you should know that. We all have crazy makers in our life. And today we're going to talk about how we can establish some healthy relationship boundaries that'll help us with the sanity of our relationships. Now, when we're talking about this idea of boundaries, we are all too familiar right now with social distancing boundaries, with what those kind of boundaries look like. In fact, we have rules right now in place, these little guidelines that say don't get closer than 6 feet with someone that's not a part of your household, and make sure you wear a mask to protect the people around you, and put on gloves and no contact. It's like my parents, when I see them, and my grandma, I want to make sure I'm careful around them. And so when I see them, I'm like, hey, Mom, like that, because you can't hug them, and that's hard and awkward, but these are the boundaries we have in place right now. But we're talking today about relationship boundaries, which I believe are actually harder boundaries to put into place and to follow because they're not quite as tangible. And let's just be quite frank, these boundaries are personal because we usually need them with the people that are closest to us, the people that we love the most, the people that affect us the most. And that makes them difficult sometimes to put into place and to enforce them, but it's something that's very valuable for us. Now, when we talk about relationship boundaries, I think of them as sort of property lines for our relationships. We all, have homes that have property lines. Maybe there's a fence that outlines your property, but we have property lines that outline physical property. We need them in our relationships as well. We need outlines to outline our relationships. We even talk sometimes about invading our personal bubble, like if someone gets too close. We need those kind of boundaries in our life to protect us in our relationships. And I think that these boundaries are really just tools, effective tools that we can use to have healthy relationships. And when I think about this idea of tools, I think that tools are our friends. I have learned through the years that having the right tool for the job is super helpful. It makes the job a lot easier. It saves you a lot of pain. Sometimes I've tried to use a hammer for something that a hammer wasn't to be used for, and I end up smashing my finger accidentally in the process. And if you use the wrong tool for the job, it doesn't bode well for you. And so having the right tool makes things smoother, simpler, and less painful. The same is true in our relationships. I was thinking this past week, if you've watched my Facebook social media posts, we posted earlier this week that we had an unexpected guest, guests, lots of guests. We had a honeybee swarm that moved into a column on the front porch of our home this week. And we're not talking like 100 or 1,000 bees. We're talking about tens upon tens of thousands of bees. Our neighbor said, I've never seen so many bees in one place in my life. And they just moved all into the column where you couldn't even see them except for the ones that were coming in and out. And we were kind of panicked, a little bit freaked out about this because number one, they're in the column. How do you get them out of there? We did our research and found out that actually gets expensive to try and remove them from your home, and it also could be dangerous because you stir up the nest, and they're not usually too happy about that. So number one, we're out of our league, and number two, we didn't have the proper tools to even be able to do this if we thought we could get into the column in the first place. But we put out a post on my Facebook page and said, help, we need help with this beehive. And, to our rescue came this wonderful couple in our church named Steve and Sharon. Steve and Sharon, if you're listening, guys, you're our new heroes. Thank you very much. But they happen to have the right tools. Number one, Steve is a contractor. So he came out with contractor tools and was able to get into the column fairly quick and painlessly. Actually, I was surprised at how he was able to get in there. Without a bee suit on, mind you, he opened up that column. But then he and his wife also had a bee suit, and they put those on. And when they opened up that first panel on the column, this is what they found inside. I've got a picture to show you. This is one of 3 columns that was just gobs and gobs of bees that were piled in there. And then we got Steve and Sharon in their appropriate attire of bee suits with the right tools. Of course, they had the bee suits and the gloves. They had a smoker to help keep the bees docile. You see that in Steve's hand. And then a handy vacuum that is designed to suck up the bees without harming them so they could transfer them to an actual a safe place for the bees to be. And here's a little video. I caught a little video footage of Steve in action. These guys did this in such an easy, smooth way that I thought maybe this wasn't even like hard for them. They didn't even break a sweat. They had the bees out of there in no time. No one got stung or hurt. It was really fun to be able to watch it, fun to watch from a distance. But I was just really excited that we had the right people for the job with the right tools. Now, when it comes to our relationship, oh, and by the way, I have a little piece of, this is a souvenir. This is some of the honeycomb that they were already building inside of our home. They had pieces that were about 2 feet long. We got a little piece here, and it smells like honey. It's just a beautiful little piece. I kind of geek out on the science of how bees put these together. But anyways, I digress. My point is that we're grateful for those people that were able to help us with that job with the right tools. And in our relationships, the same is true. We need the right tools for the job to be able to get the job done. And if we want to have healthy relationships that are easier, I don't know if any relationship could be considered easy, but easier, and that there's not as much pain involved, we need to have healthy relational boundaries in place, and that's the tools we're talking about today. Now, John 13:34, if you're following along in the notes, this is John recording the words of Jesus. Jesus says, "So now I am giving you a new commandment, love each other, just as I have loved you, you should love each other." Jesus commands us to love each other. But I want to point out, when it comes to setting up relational boundaries, you don't have to be a jerk to set up relational boundaries in your life. You can do it in a kind way. But I also want to point out to you, as Jesus talks about loving one another, that love does not always equal nice. Love and nice are not synonymous with each other. You can love people. Sometimes that means doing things that people receive and it feels kind to them that you're doing it. But sometimes love has to be firm. You've heard this statement before, tough love. And loving someone, doing something that's loving to the person in your life that you care about, isn't always the thing that feels nice, and isn't always welcomed and received with open arms by the person that we're trying to show love to. Because love is caring about the other person, not just appeasing them. And we don't want to seek to appease the other people in our relationships. We want to love them. And sometimes that means doing things that they're not necessarily comfortable with or appreciate. Now, before I give you some tips to establishing some healthy relationship boundaries, I want to point out to you 2 kinds of crazy makers that we have in our life. And they show up all over the place. And I've seen them in my life. You've seen them in your life. We might even take on some of these traits ourselves sometimes. But the first kind of crazy maker are the people in our lives that are out of control. Now, these are the kinds of people, if you think about them, that are making decisions that are not healthy for their life. And also, the decisions begin to affect the people that are around them in their life. And an idea that you might think of is this is someone maybe who has a drug or alcohol addiction problem. And not only are they harming themselves, but they're leaving a wake of destruction with all the people around them. And when we have these kinds of people in our life, the thing that we tend to try and do is we try to fix them. And that's not always the healthy thing to do. In fact, it's never the healthy thing to try and fix somebody. That's not our responsibility. That's not our job. But that's something we try to do with people that are out of control. The other kind of crazy maker that we have in our life are people that want to control. And these people are control freaks. These are the kinds of people that the closer you get to them, the more they try to control the situation, the more they try to control the relationship. They put their grip on everything they're involved in, relationally speaking. They often will use tools like guilt or anger to try and sway you their direction. They will use manipulation tactics, and sometimes they'll give little bitey comments, little passive-aggressive statements to try and influence you to do what they want you to do. And what ends up happening in these relationships, unless we're the kind of person who wants to attack back, is we tend to try and please these people. Fixing people and pleasing people is not the prescription for a healthy relationship. And so I want to give you rather 4 healthy tools that we can use in our relationships to create these boundaries. The first one that I want you to give you, and if you're following around your notes, you can see this, is that we love others without rescuing. We need to love others without rescuing. You see, rescuing makes us feel like we're helping. But notice I said it makes us feel like it, because in reality, we are not helping the people that we're in relationship with if we're rescuing them. It also makes us feel good about ourselves. We like to pat ourselves on the back after we save somebody from their situation. makes us feel like we're heroes. It makes us feel like we get to give it a hero complex, like we're just going to swoop in and save the day. And a lot of times, it creates a little bit of a codependency on our part because we need to rescue people to feel good about ourselves, to feel worth and value. But it's not a healthy situation to be in. So when it comes to relationships, one of the boundaries we need to set is we got to love them without rescuing them. I think all of us, to some degree or another, struggle with this idea of rescuing. I know probably the biggest relationship I struggle with rescuing in is me as a dad with my 2 young daughters. And there's many times where they get themselves into a situation because of a choice or decision they've made, and I feel like I can come in there and save the day and fix the situation for them. But in the process, instead of helping my daughters, I end up enabling the behavior and making it worse. See, most of the time in relationships, we are largely responsible for the state of the relationships by our efforts to rescue the other person. Now, years ago, our church sent a missions team on a trip to Kenya. And I remember hearing this story about how they went into a mud hut of this lady there was a lady who was a part of the church there in Kenya where they were doing the missions trip to. And they all crowded into her one-room mud hut on the outskirts of Kenya in the slums. And as they listened to this lady's story through a translator, they came to discover that this lady was in financial crisis. And as they heard further her story and the specifics about her situation, they found out that for about $30, they could completely end her financial crisis. And as they looked around and saw the group of them there, probably in their pockets, they had enough loose pocket change to be able to pool together and give that lady the $30 she needed in her financial crisis. But then the local pastor, when he was listening to this conversation, said, please do not do that. If you do that, you're going to ruin this situation for this lady, because you're not going to give her the dignity of being a part of the solution to the problem that she's in. And we can do this in a more responsible way, and we can hold on to that money and maybe give it to her in the right amounts at the right time, and maybe give her a pathway to take and some steps that she can take to help her situation. And then in the process, she gets to be part of the solution to her problem, as opposed to someone coming in, swooping in with their cape on and saving the day. That doesn't help us, and that doesn't help her. And I think a lot of times in our relationships, we get stuck in the situation where we identify a problem like, that's an easy one. I know how to fix that. Let me do that. Oh man, wow, I've been in that situation before. Let me take care of that one for you. But the more that we do that with the people in our lives, the more we actually harm them rather than help them. And we don't want to harm. We want to help in a relationship. So we got to be careful and not try to fix them. In fact, you need to come to the understanding you can't fix people. It's not our responsibility. That's God's job to be able to work through a change in their life. It's our job to be there to love them through that, to be able to help them when possible and when necessary. But if we try to fix their problem, it gives us a God complex, and we don't want to have that. The author Paul in the New Testament writes in his book of Galatians in chapter 6, he writes saying this. He says, share each other's burdens, and in this way obey the law of Christ. Then he goes on to say, we are each responsible for our own conduct. See, Paul gives 2 parts there. He says in verse 2, he says that we need to share each other's burdens. And that's a very legitimate thing for us to do in our relationships. When someone we know has a burden and they can't lift it on their own, man, what a great thing and a great opportunity that we have to be able to step in and hold that load with them. I think of things like a friend that needs help moving their house or whatever. We get to share in that burden. A friend is going through a crisis situation, and we can be there for moral support and be able to encourage them during that situation. There are lots of ways that we can share the burden, but Paul didn't stop there. He goes on in verse 5 to say that we are each responsible for our own conduct. And so there is this idea that we in our relationships can share burdens together, but we don't want to take over and we don't want to save and rescue, because each person is responsible for their own conduct, and we have to allow people to be able to make choices and then be able to handle and deal with the choices that they've made. And sometimes it's hard to watch that happen, but we need to allow that to happen in order for them to grow through that process and to be healthy during that process. Here's a pro tip I have for you. If you're wondering in the relationships that you have right now, if you're rescuing or enabling someone in that relationship, here's what you want to ask yourself. When I realize that I want to help you more than you want to help yourself, I'm no longer helping, I'm enabling, I am rescuing. So if you recognize in a relationship that you have currently that you are more eager, you are more intent on helping them out of their situation than they are themselves, you probably need to step back and let them deal with the consequences of the situation they're in. And that's hard to do, but very necessary. We need to love without rescuing. The second tip I want to give you today is that we need to learn to confront in love. So first we want to love others without rescuing, but then we need to learn to confront in love. I told you a couple weeks ago that I like to be liked. I want people to like me. I want people to think highly of me. I don't want enemies. I don't want anybody to be ashamed to be around me. I don't even want to be disgusted with me in any way, shape, or form, which leads me in a lot of my motivation to not like to avoid conflict. It leads me to want to avoid that because I don't want people to look down on me because I've confronted them on a situation where they needed to be confronted in, and now they don't like me because I did that. I've learned through the years that instead of running from conflict, though, I need to run to conflict. You have to deal with those situations because they only fester and get worse if you let them. And I think about if I were to go out to dinner with a friend and through the course of the meal, they get something stuck in their teeth, and I'm maybe uncomfortable with the fact that if I say something to them, I'm going to make them feel embarrassed because they had something in their teeth, and so I don't say something to them. Or, you fill in the blank, someone I know has their fly undone, or they walked out of the bathroom and there's a trail of toilet paper stuck in their shirt. All those situations, those are embarrassing, and sometimes it's hard to be able to confront someone and say, hey, you've got something in your teeth. But what is the loving thing to do in that situation? Is to let them go on and continue to embarrass themselves and continue down that course, or to stop and say, hey, I care enough about you to point this out. It's not comfortable, but we need to deal with this because you got something in your teeth. And that's what we need to do. It feels negative to confront people, but actually it's a positive thing. It's uncomfortable sometimes, but it's a positive thing to confront people. And in fact, if you want to learn more about this idea of conflict resolution, confronting, 2 weeks ago, we did a great talk about that, and I encourage you to go back and listen to that one. The problem in life is that we all have blind spots. You have blind spots, I have blind spots. In fact, I have very real blind spots when I drive my car on the far right and on the left of my car. If I'm driving down the road and I want to change lanes, I can look in the mirror, I can look behind me, but there's that one little panel on the back of the car that can block if there's a car right behind there on either side of my car. So our newest car that we have has this little thing, and if you turn the signal on and there's a car in your blind spot, it goes beep, 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 and it beeps at you, and then it flashes this light in the mirror to warn you that if you try to switch lanes, you might actually collide with the car next to you. And I really appreciate that the car warns me of these blind spots. Sometimes I find it annoying because it goes off when I'm sitting at a stoplight getting ready to turn, and it went off, and it wasn't really something I need to worry about, so sometimes it doesn't do what it's supposed to, but many times it saves me from an impending disaster, and so I'm very appreciative for the fact that the car warns me of that. We need people in our lives that are just like what our car does, that when we are going down the wrong path, that we're able to point out the blind spot in their life, and they're able to point out the blind spot in our life. I've got a friend, his name is Wade. He's been part of our campus as we launched it over 6 years ago. And when we got started, we were in a middle school, and so every week we'd have to load in an entire trailer worth of equipment and unpack it and set up church, make the school basically transform into a church, and then at the end of the day we'd pack it all up. And I remember one day in the I think it was the very first 6 months of the campus, we were setting things up, and there was a lot of chaos, a lot of things going on. And my oldest daughter, who was about 4th grade at that time, she approached me to ask me a question, and there was a lot of things going on in my mind, a whirlwind, and I was a little bit stressed out, and I kind of gave her a snappy response and sent her on her way. Now, Wade didn't say anything to me then, but later on, after everything kind of settled down and calmed down, he pulled me aside privately. He said, Mike, I watched the way that you handled your daughter, Ellie. You can tell me to go jump in a lake if you want, but I don't know that was the loving thing to do. What kind of audacity does Wade have to be able to tell me what to do with my own kid? I know how to parent. I've been doing a great job. I've got 2 great kids. Why in the world does he need to butt his nose into my business? I'll tell you why. Because I had a blind spot that morning, and I didn't even realize what I had done to my daughter, and he pointed it out. Was it comfortable for me to hear that? No. No one wants to be told they did something wrong by someone they care about. But it allowed me to be able to go back to my daughter later on that day and say, Ellie, I want to tell you that when you came up to me, I did not handle that well. I wasn't loving to you. And so we fixed the situation and said, you've got the opportunity. Anytime you want to come talk to me, I should not have responded that way. And I appreciate that I have people like Wade in my life that was able to point that out. And we all need Wades in our life to be able to point out that, and we need to be that person to the people in our lives. So when it's the right thing, we need to learn to confront in love. Matthew 18:15, Matthew records the words of Jesus. He says, if another believer sins against you, go privately. I want to pause right there and point out that Jesus says go privately. He doesn't say to write a big long email, 3 or 4 paragraphs long, and spit it off to the person that you're trying to confront. He doesn't say to get on Facebook and rant about it in front of everybody. In fact, any kind of electronic conflict resolution will usually backfire on you. What we need to do is have the courage and the decency to go to the person that we care about in person and privately. Like Wade did, he didn't announce it in front of the whole team. He pulled me aside privately. We need to pull them aside privately and confront them on the thing that we're concerned about in their life that they need help with. Essentially, what Jesus is saying, and I'll go back to the words of Jesus, he says, if another believer sins against you, go privately and point out the offense. If the other person listens and confesses it, you have won that person back. Essentially, what Jesus is saying is that if someone gets off track in their life and we care enough to say, you got something in your teeth, you have a blind spot, I'm pointing out you're going down the wrong path, you need to correct it. And if we're able to talk to them and win that person back, we've done a great service to them. Because love isn't always nice, but love does always care about the other person. See, if someone violates a boundary, we need to be willing to step in and say, that's not okay. We need to correct this situation, especially as it relates to what they're doing, harming our relationship. We need to step in and say, that's not okay. But it's not about selfishly saying, it's my way or the highway. You don't confront people and say, you need to do it my way. You need to conform to what I think needs to happen here. But it's about us going and saying, I care enough about you that I won't let you continue down this path. I care about our relationship way too much. We need to address this issue. So the first thing is love others without rescuing. Second thing is learn to confront love. And the third thing is to say no when it's best. We need to say no when it's best. We're taught from a very early age, probably because we learned the word no. It's like the very first word we learn in our vocabulary. We're taught not to say no to our parents, in those early formative years. And then our parents will come along, because kids are so transparent and say exactly what they think, and our parents will say something to us like this, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. And so we learn to be quiet and not say anything that might harm or hurt or offend somebody else. And a lot of times that's done us a disservice because we bring that into our adult years, and the people that we care about, we're afraid to say something that might hurt their feelings or offend them in some way that they need to hear, and so we don't say it to them. But the result of that is that we say no to the people that we love the most when they're the ones who most need to hear what we have to say. If we don't say no at the right time, we will tend to overextend ourselves, and we put ourselves in a situation where we're not prepared to handle what's going on. Have you ever been on an airplane? Probably not recently, but been on an airplane, and they're going through the whole spiel before you take off about safety, and if the mask drops down, what do they tell you to do? They say put the oxygen mask on the person next to you first, right? No, because you can't help them if you're dead. You kind of have to put your own mask on first. And the same thing in relationships. If we're not willing to say no when it needs to be said, we begin to overextend ourselves, and eventually we now are bringing unhealth to the relationship. I remember a time when my wife and I were going to go on a date night. We go on date nights religiously every week. We spend some time together, about 5 to 6 hours we'll spend together on a date once a week. And in the early years of our kids, when they were younger, they were very, of course, short-sighted, and they wanted to spend all the time with us, and we'd ship them off to Grandma and Grandpa to be babysat, or someone would come over and watch them. And I remember one particular time, our kids were just giving us grief. They're giving us the riot act because they're like, why are you guys leaving us? You don't care enough to be with us? You want to leave us behind and go off on your own? Why would you do that? And so Mom and Dad, we sat them down. We said, well, do you like the fact that Mom and Dad love each other? Yeah. Do you like the fact that we have a great relationship and a stable home? Yeah, we like that. Then we need to do this. And although it may be uncomfortable for you now, it may be painful for you that we're leaving you or that we're taking you over to Grandma's house to be babysat for this period of time, it's actually the loving thing for us to do to you, because as we become healthy in our relationship, we then have a healthy relationship for our home. And so sometimes you have to be willing to say no. Now, if we gave in to our kids and say, oh, no, we'll let you guys come with us, and we're saying yes, yes, you can spend time with us in that moment, that would have been the unhealthy, unloving thing to do at that time. And there are moments in our life where we have to understand that, and we have to be willing to say no when it's the right thing. Matthew records Jesus' words where Jesus says, just say a simple yes, I will, or no, I won't. Anything beyond that is from the evil one. We have to be willing to say a clear, I don't like it when, and you fill in the blank of what it is that they're infringing on in your relationship, or I would like it if you would stop. Maybe there's something they're doing that's destructive to the relationship, and you have to be willing to say that. And here's another pro tip for you. If saying yes is going to hurt you or the other person, you have to say no. That's the only logical thing to do. If saying yes to what they're requesting is going to hurt you or them or both of you, you've got to say no in that situation. So with grace, be clear and confident and say no when it's best. And the fourth and final relationship tip I want to give you about relationship boundaries today is this: give consequences when necessary. Give consequences when necessary. Now, I want to point out to you that that reality is the best teacher, and when it's possible, don't rescue. We already talked about not rescuing, just love without rescuing. We don't want to rescue them because the truth is reality will dish out the best consequences, and sometimes they are horribly painful. And we don't like to see someone we care about go through that, but sometimes that is actually the best thing that we can do, is to step back and allow them to feel the consequences of the situation they put themselves in. The wisest man who ever lived in Proverbs 19 says, hot-tempered people must pay the penalty. If you rescue them once, you will have to do it again. Wise words to live by. Now I want to stop, and if you're not a parent, bear with me for a second. Just hang on there, be patient. But I want to talk directly to you parents out there. If you're a parent and you've got kids at home right now, listen up, because this is super important. We as parents, probably more than any other relationship that we have in our life, struggle with relationship boundaries, particularly as that first thing we talked about rescuing the people in our relationships. But we need to be comfortable with the fact that our kids are not always going to like us when we show love to them by the actions that we take towards them or the guidelines and rules that we place in our home. Our kids may cry. They may get very extremely uncomfortable. It may be challenging for them. They might really struggle through something you allow them to go through, or a boundary that you put into place, or a consequence that you allow to happen, but those are necessary. That is how we grow. And as I watch the parents of my generation and the parents of the generation coming behind us, I watch and see parents that are unwilling to discipline their kids or provide consequences because they don't want to hurt their kids. And I get that. I understand you want to love your kids. You don't want to hurt them. Who wants to hurt the people they love? But you got to get back far enough to understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your kids is to give them the pain of dealing with the consequences of the situation they got themselves in. And we have to be willing to do that, or else we are enabling the behavior. We're allowing them to become entitled. We're not setting them up for success, because guess what? In life, once they're out of our home and out of our shelter and care, they're going to suffer major consequences for the actions that they take. And if they're not prepared to know how to handle that adversity, we are not doing them a service. We're doing them a disservice. So this actually, by the way, I'll bring everybody back in this conversation. This goes for any relationship that you have. Do not enable, and be willing to lay down very firm consequences for your relationship, the people in your relationship with. If they violate it and you have to put down a consequence, be very, very firm in doing that. Now, I want to point out to you what the author of Hebrews says in Hebrews 12:11. He says, no discipline is enjoyable while it's happening. It's painful. But afterward, there will be a peaceful harvest of right living for those who are trained in this way. Now, if you have a college-age son living at your home, and he's never been really good at getting up when his alarm clock goes off, maybe he stays up late gaming or watching Netflix or something like that, and he has a hard time getting up in the morning, and you're constantly coming in, coaxing him, and his alarm gone off like 6-7 times, and you come in and you push and you gently, and I'll make you a nice breakfast if you get up now, and he's got to get to work, but he's not getting up on time. I mean, every morning there's this routine of you going in and trying to wake him up and trying to get him on and make sure he gets out the door on time. That's not helpful to him. But you know the reality of the consequence of letting him sleep in? Imagine what would happen if his alarm went off and you did nothing, because he's supposed to get up with his alarm clock and he's supposed to get himself ready for his work on time and get to his job. What's it going to feel like that first time he has to walk in, work late, and explain to his boss he overslept? First time might be not too bad, but then there's second and third time that happens. I guarantee the pain of that choice will definitely speak more volumes than you trying to coax him and rescue him and help him through that and not allow him to experience those consequences. So we've got to do that. Now, I'm going to give you 4 guidelines when establishing consequences that are for boundaries that are not in your notes. I encourage you to write these down. These are worth writing down. The first thing, if you can, is to let reality be the one that teaches and dishes out the consequences. But if that's not possible, if you actually need to be proactive with setting up consequences, here's the first thing. Number 1, you need to establish the consequences in advance with the people in relationship that you're in. If this happens, this is what's going to happen. And when you do that, the second thing is that you need to be very clear on what the consequence is. If you do X, Y will happen. This is the way it's going to work. That's exactly what's going to happen. The third thing you need to do is you need to make your consequences realistic. Don't say, if that happens again, I'm out of here. Or if that happens again, then I'm never going to help you ever in your life ever again. That's not realistic. It's not helpful. No one believes you in that situation. So make your consequences realistic. They need to have some pain involved, but make them realistic. And then the fourth and final thing is that you need to stick to your guns. If you say you're going to do something, if in our relationship, if you violate this boundary and I say this is the consequence, you better be sure to make sure that you follow through on that, because if you don't, they'll never believe you again that actually is going to happen. And you have to make sure that you're setting up these clear guidelines through that process. Now, as we wrap out, I want to tell you that there's so much more to talk about on this idea of relationship boundaries that we don't have time to really dive into. And so I want to provide you a resource. There's a book out there, a really great book that was written by Henry Cloud and John Townsend. It's called Boundaries. You see a picture of it there on the screen. In your notes tab, there is also a link to go to Amazon to buy that book. But I encourage you to pick that up and dive deeper. And this is a very helpful, very valuable book for you. I highly encourage you to do this if you need help in this area of relationship boundaries. Even if you think you're doing good, you could always get a pick-me-up and something that kind of shore you up and help you get better at this. But I want to encourage you, when you're reading a book, I want to teach you the right way to read a book. And by the way, if you read a book, you're ahead of the average person who graduates from college who never touches a book again. Pick up a book and read it. It'll change your life. And also, if you have the excuse, well, I just don't read very well, I don't like reading, get the audiobook and listen to it to and from when you're driving to and from places. But don't let that be an excuse. You need to learn this stuff. In relationship boundaries, here's what you do. You listen or read the book, and as you do and something stands out to you, you need to take notes on it. And then don't stop there, but after you've taken notes, you need to go back when you're done with that segment that you're reading, and you need to reflect on your notes. Reflect on what you wrote down and what stood out to you and what was important. And then the final thing you need to do is you need to write out a list of action items. Well, I learned this, and I've seen myself kind of get caught in that in this situation. I think what I need to do based on what I read is I need to do this. And you can set up yourself some action steps. Much like what we do every week in our notes, you'll see at the bottom of the notes tab, we have my next steps. And I encourage you to do that every week when you listen to these talks, is that you don't just listen to them, but you take notes on what you're learning, that you reflect on them, and then you take action steps. And we've provided for you 4 suggested action steps right there in your notes that you can take into account. I'm going to read them off to you. Next step number 1, today I'm making a first-time decision to follow Jesus. If you've never done that before, if you've never had a relationship with Jesus and you want to do that today, man, that is the absolute best next step that you could take right now, would be to do that. The second one, I'll write out my personal boundaries this week. If you don't have very specific boundaries in the relationships that you're struggling in right now, one of the best next steps you could do this week is to write those boundaries out and then have a conversation with the person on the other end of those boundaries about them. Maybe even work on them together. The third thing is, I will practice this boundary, and maybe there's a boundary that you struggle with. Maybe you are the offender, or maybe there's a boundary where you allow someone else to offend you and you keep giving in on it. And you write that in there and you practice that this week. And then the final one, I will memorize Proverbs 4:23 this week, which says, guard your hearts above all else, for it determines the course of your life. What a great verse for you to memorize, to understand that it's easy for us to fool ourselves. We are very deceptive with our own selves. In our minds, we can fool ourselves so easy, we can dupe ourselves. And when it comes to relationship boundaries, we can constantly talk ourselves out of them. We can constantly talk ourselves into not setting them. We can constantly talk ourselves into going back and out and rescuing somebody again. But you've got to guard your heart above all else. And what a great verse to memorize to remind you that you need to be very careful and guarded in this situation. So as we wrap up today, the first thing we want to do relationally is we need to love each other without rescuing. We need to learn to confront in love. We need to say no when it's best. And we need to give consequences, clear consequences, when it is necessary. Let's pray. Dear God, help us to take a closer look at our relationships. Help us to identify the areas where we are weak, and when it comes to relational boundaries, where we need to work on them. Give us the discernment to take action on what we learned today, whether it's to learn to love without rescuing, to confront in love, to say no when it's the right thing to do, or to give consequences when it's necessary. Give us wisdom and courage to take steps towards relational health. God, thank you that you've provided for us insight and direction that we need for healthy living in your Scripture. Help us each take steps this week towards becoming the people you want us to be, as we identify our best next step towards building healthy habits into our lives. Lord, as each person tuning in goes about their week, guide them in their daily agendas. Help them to navigate the sticky relational situations that they are faced with and will be faced with this week. Give them favor and allow them to experience real progress. And for all of us today, God, keep us healthy. Help us to fix our eyes on you. We love you. In your name we ask these things. Amen.